ויוצאים בתמופת ותרסם ינasek ומצוקותיהם ישיים. וישיבו מהר לחיק משפחותיהם, return them to their families. יודעת לבני חסדו ולפלויסו לבני אדם, ויקוים בהם מקרא שכסוב, ופודויה אדוני ישורון, ובא ציון ורינה, בשמחת העולם על ראשן, סוסן ושמחה ישיגו, ונוסו יוגן ואנוכה, ונאמר, אמן.
Thank you, David. And we do pray for their safe homecoming and for all the IDF soldiers. Thank you to Laurel and Tom. Thank you so much for hosting tonight. I'm not sure when you agreed to this, you realise how big it might be. We really appreciate your support and solidarity. I'd also like to recognise Esther Frankel, who's the Federal President of UIA, who is in attendance with her husband, David, and to particularly thank Amanda, Alyssa, Ash, Serena, Leora, Shana and Carly for not only helping to organise this event, but for widening it to a far broader audience with a different topic. So thank you so much. Our work at Karen Hayesod UIA continues at pace, and honestly, I wish it didn't. We've been encouraged, we've been so encouraged by the immediate and significant and generous support of our community. The fact that we have, 150 people here tonight is testament to that. With your help, the Victim of Terror Fund is now helping over 5,000 families affected, and we're helping with such basics as clothes and food and nappies, the very basics of living, and much needed emergency accommodation. We've literally transported and relocated thousands and thousands of vulnerable Olim from the south to relative safety. And I believe Israel has relocated over 250,000 people from the south. It can be done. At appropriate time, our focus will shift. We will never leave those victims of terror, but we'll have added burdens and added responsibilities. And primarily, those will be helping Israel rebuild. But those are in the months ahead. Tonight's theme is different. It is prescient, and it is incredibly important. Tonight's theme is about education and advocacy. Before I introduce our first person, who is a geopolitical star, I'd like to make a few comments on observations that are personal to me, but I'm sure reflect the way many of us are feeling at the moment. On October 7, Hamas declared war on Israel with the most barbaric acts of terror any of us have ever witnessed. 48 hours later, another war was declared on October 9, and this time it was against Jews in the diaspora. We were confronted with vile protests in the name of Palestinian solidarity around the world, calls for the destruction of Israel, the extermination of Jews in London, in the US, and in continental Europe, as well as the Middle East. Clean the world of Israel, many said, and much worse. In Paris, Star of Davids were being painted on the homes of Jews. In Russia, we saw basically a lynch mob trying to attack Jewish passengers who had arrived by plane. At US universities, Jewish students being put into lockdown, specifically at Harvard. Jewish students at Harvard were advised to go into lockdown or being barricaded into areas for their own safety. What year are we living in? At Cornell University, messages were being posted online to find Jewish students. This was by students, to find Jewish students and to slit their throats. The only good news of today is that one of those students has been charged federally. And when the feds get involved, he's been charged with incitement to violence. He's been charged with about 17 different hate crimes. I hope and I wish that would happen more often, because the rhetoric and the abuse is unacceptable. And as Jews, we need to stand proud against it. But closer to home, protests in Sydney and Melbourne, in particular with chants of gas the Jews and from the river to the sea, calling for the extermination of Israel. Academics and unionists calling Israel genocidal, apartheid, and other historic and false libels. In my lifetime, I've certainly never experienced this level of open Jew hatred. What used to be whispered is now being said out loud. And to me, it seems like it's open season on Jews. But I know, and I can tell by the solidarity at this event, the solidarity at so many events happening around the community. And by the way, I want to acknowledge all the community organisations who are doing such an incredible job in gathering support and gathering unity and ensuring that we stay together, because we will not cower before these bigots. We will stand up, we will be united, and we'll be proud of who we are. But at the same time, we need to be responsible in our defence. So what I mean by that is I've seen a lot of things online from some Jewish members of our community that are particularly hateful and probably over-aggressive in the response. We have to remember our Jewish values. We have to remember who we are as a people. And we cannot stoop so low as to get involved in personal abuse, personal attacks that are as vile as the attacks that we experience. We need to be mature and nuanced in all of our responses, but we'll learn about more about this later when we have a fantastic guest who is speaking from Stand With Us around advocacy and how to combat and defend ourselves against anti-Semitism. But now it is my immense honour to introduce our first speaker, Yuval Rotem. Yuval is a veteran of 35 years. Hello, Yuval. Yuval, I'm sorry, God. Yuval is a veteran of 35 years in Israel's diplomatic corps. And by the way, I've met him 3 or 4 times, so now I'm really embarrassed. He served as Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs until 2020. He served as Israel Ambassador to Australia between 2007 and 2013, and non-resident Ambassador to Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and New Zealand. He previously held the role of Consul General in Los Angeles between 1999 and 2004. I could go on. He holds a BA and MA in Political Science and International Relations with distinction from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. What Yuval doesn't know about foreign affairs, diplomacy, and geopolitics is probably not worth knowing. As I said, I've had the honour of meeting and listening to Yuval on a number of occasions, and I'm sure you'll benefit from discussion. Yuval, welcome to Melbourne, Australia. I hope you can hear me. And we have a couple of hundred people, I think, of very strong Israel supporters who have your back, who have the country's back, who are waiting to hear from you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for this beautiful words of introduction. And I very much would like to share with you the sentiments, what you have said about Jewish experiences overseas. We definitely are aware about the meaning that whatever we do, whatever we pursue in our own part of the world has an impact on each and every one of you in your own communities. So we understand fully the implication and the consequences of the situation. And we shall, I don't know if we have been in these kinds of situation before in terms of having these kinds of experiences, both when we have a sovereign Jewish state and you over there, communities overseas, but I definitely believe that as we have prevailed throughout the history, we will do it one more time. As Golda Meir used to say to Senator Joe Biden back in August 1973, a statement that President Biden keep repeating all the time, we have a secret weapon. We have no other place to go. And it's very much the case. Let me say the following. We woke up on October 7th, the darkest day of Israeli history. I don't think we have, in our wild imagination, we thought that that's going to be a day like that in our own country. It is not a war in the way we have brought up with. I'm 63, I was born in Israel. I'm fifth generation for my Israeli from my father's side. And I have to say that the images and the stories that surfaced on October 7th, all those stories and images were not typical to a war. It was stories that we thought and we actually prayed are echo an episode in our own history. It was almost inconceivable to contemplate with the idea that they are again a reality and present in our own place in Israel. And I think this is one of the most deep sentiments that we take with us, because as a proud born Israeli, the stories was of my grandfather, which I heard or passed on to us about what they went through in some of those Eastern European countries. Suddenly, I live it, I experience it. And that's live with us a very, very strong impact. I would say that October 7th is one of the most defining moments of our nation. And everything that came before will not be the same in terms of what lies ahead. This is the threshold. This is a fault line. Nothing is going to be the same. Nothing. And we have to cross this line to be able to understand what's at stake and to understand how to address it. And it's going to be complicated. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be bloody. But there's no other way. So, because perception-wise, the idea that we can live side by side next to an evil, this concept was destroyed on the morning of October 7th. Ever since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, we thought that there is a way you can manage them, you can deal with them, you can control them. This is not the case. October 7th has revealed itself that it's either we or them. There is no option. And the consequences and the implication of this reality or new reality beyond October 7th, it is very complicated, very difficult to all of us to deal with that. Because if you apply this principle to the South, you may need to apply this principle to the North as well. You cannot let one era or one side or one front to address the issue and leave evil on the other side as well. So either we understand fully the consequences of October 7th or not. And when you look at that, when you understand what's at stake, what's going to unfold, it's complicated. It's very, I don't want to give you a sense of despair or depression, but the next few months and next few years for Israel are going to be a test to our resolve, to our resilience, to our stamina. And we have no other place to go. So this is it. This is the future that lies ahead after October 7th. There will be no discount. We will not be able to overlook it. This is the new reality. And we shall have to shape it in a way that is going to serve our interest for long term. I think what we have seen in the last few months, the last few weeks, is at least an important efforts by the American geostrategically, to keep this war limited and contained. I think President Biden fully understood on October 7 the implication of the attack on Israel, namely creating a situation that actors are not going to step in and to introduce themselves into the conflict. And what you have seen ever since is an effort by the American to make sure that this projection of weakness of Israel on October 7 is going to be substituted by a projection of power by Israel, allied themselves with America to be able to create a sense for the other actors that they don't have any incentive to step in. And when President Biden put over here unprecedented size of an armada and tell Hezbollah and Iran simply don't, he means that. And I think it's very critical to understand that from now on, when we pursue our own agenda, we have to understand that we need to keep regional American interests at stake, because that serving Israel interest for long run, especially after October 7. We might not be what we thought we are. That's the reason why to have the American back is so critical, is so important. Generating a sense of alliance from a superpower that has declared its policy to fade away from the Middle East, to step away from the Middle East, to have a new pivot, which is basically the Indo-Pacific area. So when America has decided to deploy this massive structure and formation in the East Mediterranean basin, that means that we have also not just a superpower backing us, but also that we have to factor in their interest in the region, which is basically our own interest as well. Most of them, if not all of them. Israel is now attacked from 3 more areas that we need to address. From Lebanon by Hezbollah, from northeast, from Syrian militias that basically associate themselves with either Hezbollah or Iranian militia, and from the south, from Yemen. This is a new threat, a new war theater that was not yet tested, but in the last week we have seen efforts by the Houthi, which is a militia backed by Iran, launching ground missiles, cruise missiles, and drone into Israel. Some of them were intercepted by America. Some of them were intercepted by Saudi Arabia. And yesterday, they were intercepted by Israel. So we understand what it's stake. We understand that there is a need for us also to try to stay focused on our own mission, which is basically Gaza and the elimination of Hamas, because it's important, it's critical, it's actually a survival dimension that we are going to reestablish a line of deterrence. A line that means they fear from us and we are not fear from them. Otherwise, Hamas will have time to rebuild itself and to relaunch these kinds of attacks. And if we want to make sure that Israel can not just survive, but also prosper, the only way for us to do that is to go by air, by sea, by ground, into Gaza, eliminate the threats, creating a new line of deterrence. And that's going to be prolonged, costly, bloody, and likely, because of the nature of the landscape in Gaza and the fact that Hamas is embedded in a very densely populated area, there are also going to be some casualties, unfortunately, on their side. And it doesn't matter how much we are going to try to avoid this, we are going to be blamed. That is almost an axioma that we need to acknowledge and to understand. And yet, we need to fight back. We need to stand up and we need to speak up against what took place over here on October 7th. It was not a typical war. This was an attack on Israel. It was basically an idea of a war of extermination. And as I say, in the end of the day, when this is going to be over, it's either we or them. One dimension that complicates this entire war theater is, of course, the issue of hostages. Because we never before, I don't think there's any protocol in any country. How do you deal with well over 200 hostages, which are primarily children, women, elderly? I cannot be envied with anyone who needs to make this decision-making process in Israel. Not because there's no protocol, because the human dimension, because the human elements, how can you reconcile what you want to do militarily and geostrategically, and with your heart and mind that want to see a safe return of all those hostages. And this is it's a hell of decision-making process. But this is what we have to do. This is what we have to address. And there's no other way to do that. Inaction is not anymore the luxury that we can pursue. And above all, Iran is behind the scene. Iran has basically played a major role in all these activities. And those who have pursued in the past a policy of embracement or acknowledgement, or even to some extent appeasement of Iran, they also will have to ask themselves what was their contribution and their role to the October 7th event. It's nothing to do with them. It's more about Hamas. It's primarily about Hamas, its doctrine, its idea, its philosophy. It's about us. But the idea, how come we have come to the point that Iran is actually controlling practically 4 different Arab countries, dealing and providing support and fund and training and ideas to non-state actors like in Yemen, Houthi, in Lebanon, Hezbollah, in Gaza, Hamas. And we all have decided that we might want to be able to control this kind of phenomena. And yet, a year and a half ago, Iran actively moved into the war between Russia and Ukraine, which means American interests and European interests were undermined daily in the most important war in Europe since Second World War. And Iran publicly and openly intervened on behalf of Russia. Question: where was the West? Where was America? Where was Australia? when their interests were undermined by Iran daily. So sometimes inaction cannot be the preferred policy, because the implication of inaction today can be worse in other places. And I have to say that when you look at the behavior of Russia today, or even China today, other players that would like to play a role in this war, they don't have maybe the interest to see the war limited and contained. They would like to see maybe more regional confrontation, to have more hotspots in the world, because it may serve their own interest. I want to be too cynical, but this is the reality. Because the language and the tone, the actions, are not necessarily supporting to have a war limited and contained in the region. And it's done by those who are supposed to provide security and safety and peace for this world. So this is what we're dealing with. Unprecedented event, a catastrophe on its nature, stories and images that evoke stories from the Holocaust and from the Eastern European life 100 years ago. And when you see the lynch mob in Russia searching for the Jews, hunting for the Jews, these are the stories I remember, heard from my grandfather. Never thought that I would see it in my own life. And I think that even though we are deeply saddened, strongly devastated, we have a lot to think about and to withdraw the lessons for all of us. What is the reality out there? And when you see this liberal West embracing radical Islam in such a way, it's not just painful. The betrayal of the liberal West is the most, I would say, devastating element that I have seen, at least in the last 3.5 weeks. I didn't have any illusions. But when you see politicians, when you see members of the academia, when you see intellectuals celebrating the massacre of Israelis in such a way, and then chanting from the river to the sea, which is basically insinuation of the destruction of Israel, all those guys in the liberal West who likely don't even know what is the real meaning of this radical Islam means, they will have no life, they will have no ability, no capacity to stay around if these guys are going to take over. So instead of supporting us fighting their own fight, they're supporting them. It's not going to help them. The reality that they will have to face will be by far more complicated than the one we see. We don't have a choice. We understand what at stake, and we are going to perform the stamina, the resilience, and the resolute to make sure that the one who's going to stay here is us and not them. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your support. Thank you for your understanding. It's not a given today. And I'm sure that you understand that in the end of the day, if we are going to have the upper hand, when America is going to have the upper hand, will we, the West, not those who are supporting Hamas, but those who are supporting us, will prevail, the world is going to be a better place. Not just for Israel and for the Jews, but also for all those who at this moment either prefer to stay silent or not have the guts to say publicly and loudly that they understand what it's doing. So thank you for your support and for your contribution and your sympathy, and above all, care and concern about the fate and destiny of Israel and my people. Thank you.
Yuval, we want to thank you for joining us this evening. And we know how incredibly busy you are, and we appreciate that you're making the time to connect with our community. Your qualified insights are invaluable, and your sobering thoughts on the ramifications of the past 3.5 weeks are critical to our understanding of what's to come. We wish you and your family well and continued safety, and know that you have a united and strong support from here in Australia. We know you must get to several further urgent meetings, so we sincerely thank you and will now let you go.
Thank you. Thank you.
To introduce myself, I'm Amanda Smorgan, the co-chair of UIA Women's Division, together with my sister, Alyssa Sharp. Especially over the past 3 weeks, it's been an honour and a privilege to hold this role within an organisation that has truly been at the forefront of providing meaningful impact and support on the ground in Israel. As Peter noted, the bias and blatant anti-Semitism that's reared its head in the past few weeks has been really confronting. Our community is overwhelmed, we're hurting, and at the same time, we're still having to engage in robust online conversations. We've seen so many examples here in Melbourne over the past few days alone, including the anti-Semitic banners at Hope Street Radio in Collingwood Yards, and the violent anti-Zionistic rants of an owner of the Lune Croissant Bakery. Collins Street office building with Jewish tenants was locked down on Monday due to a pro-Palestinian protest. Posters with kidnapped faces are being vandalised and torn down, and universities are issuing statements painting Israel as genocidal, apartheid, or colonizer state. Workplaces don't feel safe, schools have increased security, and from the river to the sea slogans becoming prolific. And over and above the financial support that UIA is providing on the ground in Israel, we also feel that we've got another important role to play, hasbara, which means providing you with the education and the tools to have robust and considered conversations and dialogues about Israel that are constructive and useful. So we're therefore really grateful to have Noah Shufutinsky join us from America, from Stand With Us. Noah is a Jewish educator, lecturer, and musician. As a graduate of George Washington University, he earned his BA in Judaic Studies and was heavily involved in Jewish life and Zionistic activism. Shortly after graduating, he made Aliyah, where he began working as the education and outreach manager at Stand With Us in their Jerusalem office. He's a qualified speaker on Israeli and Jewish history, the intricacies of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and how anti-Semitism affects global Jewry. Noah is going to arm us with the tools to have difficult conversations and to provide tips on how to advocate for Israel on social media in a productive and effective manner. He'll highlight some of the key trends that are arising online and provide us with strategies to engage and discredit. Noah is happy to take questions from the audience at the end, which will be facilitated by Shana Black, Women's Division Executive Member. Noah, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's honored to be here, and good evening. So my name again is Noah Shufutinsky, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager for the Stand With Us office of Jerusalem. And today we're going to be doing a brief overview of history in the land, including the roots of the current conflict that's ongoing. We'll touch base a little bit about some of the details, understanding that you all are somewhat familiar with what's been going on because we all care deeply about Israel and Israeli people there. And then we're going to focus again on these key trends that are going on around the world. And then I'd love to open it up at the end for Q&A, where we can have a chance to discuss specifically what's been going on in Melbourne and different ways that we can, in a united way, respond to some of the horrible anti-Semitic events and tropes that have been all too common in the past 3 weeks or so. Without further ado, I want to introduce myself and Stand With Us, which is an education organization aimed at supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism around the world. And we're proud to have an office in Australia now. So to begin with, we're going to start out with understanding Israel, understanding the Jewish story, understanding Israel's story and how that's related to the current conflict. So to begin with, one of the first things that a lot of people don't understand that leads to some of these misconceptions we see today is the basic aspects of the Jewish story, which is understandable that it's difficult to understand, given the fact that it's 3,000 years and there's not necessarily, or 3,000 plus years, and there's not necessarily ample time in most of these conversations, even on social media, to dive into the details. But one way that we can explain our story is that we have our indigenous roots in the land of Israel, where we originate as a people. We have experienced dispossession and oppression out of that land, all the while maintaining our connection to where we come from, some physically, people who stayed in the land of Israel for thousands of years, as well as throughout the diaspora, Jews were oppressed because of our connection in the land we come from. And finally, liberation, which is today the fact that we have access to our homeland. We have a state in our homeland, and we have a military that's there and able to protect us. Brief overview of the historical timeline. I'm not going to dive too much into it. We talk about the Jewish story. Our story starts over 4,000 years ago from our perspective and from our narrative with Abraham and Sarah. And you look at archaeology, what starts to sort of add up with that would be the Israelites, the Israelite kingdom, roughly 3,000 years ago. And over the course of history since then, you've had different empires ranging from the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans, who've taken over the territory and treated Jews a variety of ways, expelling Jews, oppressing Jews, and at times also treating Jews as equal subjects of an empire. That being said, the common thread is that the Jewish people historically, during these times and periods of imperial occupation of our territory, were not able to take our destiny into our own hands. So this idea of Zionism that we have today is something that dates back at least 2,500 years to the first time under the Babylonians that the Jewish people were exiled and strived to return home. It, of course, has the modern context of today, where we have modern Zionism that is actualized in the state of Israel. Now, when we're telling this Jewish story and the story of Zionism, we have to understand who we're talking to. That's step one. 5% of people we're going to talk to might be Zionist, meaning they know that Zionism is the belief in a Jewish state in the land of Israel. We already talked about how we have 2,500 years of history of wanting to be able to return home and attempting to actualize that. Theodore Herzl was the one who was able to put it into a contemporary political framework in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that meant having an actual Jewish state in the ancient indigenous homeland of the Jewish people. So 5% of people understand what Zionism is and identify as Zionists. You also have 5% of people on the other side of the spectrum who understand what Zionism is, but identify as anti-Zionists for reasons that they don't believe the Jewish people deserve the equal right of self-determination on their indigenous homeland. That being said, in the middle, you have 90% of people who are apathetic, so they don't necessarily care. They're misinformed, so they've been fed misinformation, false facts about Israel, about Zionism, about the Jewish people and the Jewish story, or uninformed, meaning that they don't know anything that's going on, even if they might care about it. And a lot of that 90% identifies as anti-Zionist because they believe a false narrative perpetuated by the 5% of anti-Zionists. This false narrative that Jews are white European colonizers who came to Palestine and stole it from the Palestinians. We're going to touch on why this is problematic briefly before we get into more of the modern history. And then from there, we'll start to talk more about the different tropes that are seen today. But to begin with, let's break it down. Claiming that Jews are white Europeans is false for two reasons. One, it completely ignores the existence of Jewish communities and Jewish people, such as myself, who are not white appearing, and other Jewish communities and Jewish people whose diaspora experience never included Europe. You have Jews who went from Israel to Ethiopia, back to Israel, Israel to Iraq, back to Israel, Israel to Turkey, back to Israel, so on and so forth. In addition to that, if we're taking a look at Jewish communities that spent their diaspora in Europe, classifying them as white European is also false, because you have people like my father, who came from the former Soviet Union, who was born in the European part of the Soviet Union. That being said, he was never treated and never saw himself as a European. It's stamped on his birth certificate that he's Yevray, he's a Jew, he's not a Russian. So I think it's very important for us to be able to understand that when we're looking at this false narrative, there's multiple ways to dismantle it. The next part, we have to examine the fact that many people view or attempt to perpetuate this narrative that Jews, specifically Zionists in Israel, are colonizers. Now, in order to be a colonizer, someone has to come from a mother country and establish a colony in the name of that mother country and attempt to basically spread the culture of that mother country in a land that's foreign, that they don't have a connection to. That doesn't apply to the Jewish people factually. We already established that we as Jews have an indigenous connection to the land of Israel. Our mother language, our mother tongue, is Hebrew, which is the only surviving indigenous language of the land of Israel. And our culture, from religious aspects to the way we count our calendar, is indigenous to the land of Israel. So to classify Jewish people returning to the land where we came from as colonizers is factually incorrect at best and a malicious lie at worst, which is unfortunately very often. Finally, the idea that they came to Palestine and stole it from Palestinians is completely devoid of any context. The term Palestine to refer to the territory came about 2,000 years ago when the Romans renamed the land of Israel, at the time the region of Judea, as Syria Palestina, in an effort to spite Jews by naming their homeland after their biblical arch nemesis, the Philistines. Philistines were a people who came from the Greek Isles of the Mediterranean, established an actual settler colony in southern Israel in the area of Gaza, and were an arch nemesis of the Jewish people. The Romans renamed the territory after them to spite the Jews when the Romans were occupying the land. Since then, the territory has been referred to as Palestine by other controlling and conquering empires. That being said, there was never an Arab state of Palestine. So when people talk about the Jews came to Palestine, they make it seem as if we as Jewish people came to this Arab state of Palestine and stole it from Palestinians. But the fact of the matter is, you always had Jewish people who lived in the territory of Palestine, which the land of Israel was referred to. And within that, anyone, whether they were Arab, Druzi, Circassian, Jewish, or a variety of other ethnicities that dwelled in the territory, were referred to as Palestinians. So going back to this false narrative, saying that Jews came to Palestine and stole it from the Palestinians implies that there was a Palestinian people that the Jews themselves were not part of, which again is false at best and a malicious lie at worst. It ignores the historical connection of the Jewish people to our indigenous land. Goes right back to the basic way to understand our story. We have our indigenous roots in the land of Israel. We've experienced the diaspora, overcome over 1900 years of oppression across Europe and the Middle East, and finally experiencing liberation, meaning that we've been able to return to Israel and build a thriving, diverse, and democratic state. Now let's dive into some more of the modern history that led to the current conflict, and then we're going to wrap up and move into some of those action items to give us the tools to combat some of these false narratives that are extremely common today. So we discussed how the territory, we had a chance to briefly look at that timeline. One of the more recent points on that timeline would be the Ottoman control of the territory when there was Ottoman Palestine. Now, at that time, there wasn't an independent state of Palestine. It was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and you had Jewish people who were living throughout this territory continuously, who were mistreated under Ottoman rule, as well as Jews across the world spread out in the diaspora who wanted to return home. At the time of the Ottomans, especially towards the time when their empire would fall, you had a variety of different movements around the world of people who belonged to the land where they were living, didn't want to live under empires anymore. And of course, the Middle East and the Jewish people were not an exception to this rule. So we get modern political Zionism, meaning that you have Jewish people who are saying, we don't want to live under the Ottoman Empire, we want to have our own state. Ultimately, that starts to pick up steam, and it's going to eventually come to fruition after World War I. The British defeat the Ottoman Empire, having promised Jewish population, the Zionists, as well as also giving a promise to Arab nationalists who are descendants of settlers who arrived in the region with the Islamic conquest following the death of Muhammad and continued to migrate during the period of the Ottomans, offering them both a state. Now, what did this look like? The British ended up defeating the Ottomans, and they took over a territory that they had divided up with the French Empire at the time. And essentially what they set up was the British Mandate of Palestine. If you look at this map of the 1920 League of Nations Palestine Mandate, one thing that's extremely glaring to notice is that Palestine includes modern-day Jordan. Now, originally the idea was that this territory has been promised both to Jews and to Arabs. So British get to thinking, and they end up dividing the land. They divide the land into Transjordan, which became an Arab state fulfilling one of the promises to one of the Arab leaders that they had promised a state to, and the remaining territory west of the Jordan River remains the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, many people thought, obviously, the Mandate of Palestine is going to become the Jewish state, but that's not quite the situation because of a variety of complexities, including the fact that you still have a large population of Palestinian Arabs living with Palestinian Jews. It's key terminology to understand that everyone at the time was considered Palestinian who are living in the remaining Mandate of Palestine. So the British kind of kicked the can down the road a little bit. You have tensions rising between Arab nationalists who refuse to accept any Jewish presence in the land and Zionist Jewish people who are immigrating and returning home to their homeland from a wide array of places around the world, especially Europe and the Middle East. As these tensions are rising, one way that the British seek to solve it is one, restricting Jewish immigration so as not to further anger some of those Arab nationalist extremists, their easy button. But it doesn't solve the root of the issue because it's still persecuting the Jewish population that was promised a state here. Another way is attempting to partition the territory. So in 1937, you get the Peel Commission. It's the first attempt at partitioning the state. The Orange Territory was going to be an Arab state. The Green Territory is going to be a Jewish state. There is a disparity compared to how it looks today, but it was roughly proportional to the Jewish and Arab populations at the time. You have a variety of opinions. You have many Jews at the time who say, we shouldn't accept this because it's not enough to build a sustainable state in the future. You also have many Zionists and Jewish leaders at the time who say, we're not in a position to negotiate. This is the solution we need to accept. You have this intense debate, and in the end, the idea is that half a loaf of bread is better than no bread, and the Zionist leadership at the time chooses to accept this partition. Of course, across Arab society, which is also diverse, you have a variety of opinions, but Arab leadership completely rejects this partition plan, asserting that there should be no Jewish state at all in this territory. The next partition plan comes up in 1947. Obviously, since then, you've had World War II and the Holocaust, which I'll talk about separately for the sake of understanding the different interests. For the interests of the British have just gone through World War II, suffered immense losses, and don't have the energy anymore, nor the resources to continue policing the tensions that are rising between Zionists and Arab nationalists and the fighting that's going on in the region. So they want to partition the plan and wipe their hands clean. At the same time, you have Jewish leaders in the Jewish community who's just been through the Holocaust and ethnic cleansing across Europe, and also that's increasing across the Middle East and North Africa. So you have more and more understanding of the cost of not having a Jewish state amongst the Jewish community and the necessity to have a Jewish state.
זוהי זכותו הטבעית של העם היהודי להיות ככל עם ועם עומד ברשות עצמו במדינתו הריבונית.
So in 1947, that partition plan was passed, and it dictated that in 1948, in May, the British would leave and relinquish control along those partition lines to create a Jewish state and an Arab state. Now, on May 14th, on the eve of the British leaving, Israel was declared a sovereign state, and you had already had this tension going on. It was basically a Palestinian civil war between Palestinian Arab militias and Palestinian Jewish militias at the time. Now, that changes in May 14th when Israel becomes a state. Those Palestinian Jews are no longer Palestinian Jews, they're Israelis. Now, that conflict escalates between the Israeli forces and the Palestinian Arab forces, who are then joined by 5 neighboring Arab nations that invade. And it's very important to understand the goal of this war was for it to be a war of annihilation, a momentous massacre in history that will be talked about like the massacres of the Mongols or the Crusades. Now, this isn't a modern understanding. These are the direct words of Abid al-Rahman Azam Pasha, the Secretary General of the Arab League at the time, who was leading this charge. Now, ultimately, after a very bloody war and costly war for Israel, Israel was able to fend off those nations and create the Israeli state and defend its borders, which look like what's here on the map all the way on the right. What you see there is you see the territory in the yellow ends up being the Jewish state, much a bit larger than it was originally partitioned to it. The West Bank was taken over by Jordan. So again, you don't have a Palestinian state. You have those Palestinian Arabs who are now under Jordanian control in the West Bank. And then the Gaza Strip is taken over by Egypt. So again, there's not a Palestinian state. You have those Palestinian Arabs who remain in the Gaza Strip who are under Egyptian control. You had refugee crises after this, which we can have time to jump into for Q&A if there's more room to elaborate on it. But for now, we're going to examine how the situation changed, and we're going to shift from the Arab-Israeli into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So between 1949 and 1967, that was the status quo with the Egyptians in Gaza and the Jordanians in the West Bank. In 1967, that changes with the Six-Day War, in which Israel, in a defensive strike, was able to succeed in defeating neighboring Arab states who were amassing on their borders, preparing for another genocidal war. Israel took the Gaza Strip from Egypt, took Sinai from Egypt as well, took the West Bank, Judea and Samaria from Jordan, and took the Golan Heights from Syria. Initially, Israel hoped that they'd be able to negotiate land for peace because of, again, various complexities on the ground and Arab rejectionism. Immediately after, neighboring Arab countries passed the 3 no's in Khartoum, Sudan, saying no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel. Now, for the Arab states, isolating Israel was a good thing, and as we know, all good things don't last. So ultimately, after more conflict that, again, we're not going to dive into too much right now, but that includes the Yom Kippur War, which was incredibly brutal and traumatic for Israeli society. As tides start to turn, Israel begins making peace with neighboring Arab states. So Egypt and Israel make peace in 1979, and as part of this deal, up for negotiation, of course, is the Gaza Strip, which prior to that had been Egyptian territory, not a Palestinian state. What ends up happening is Israel ends up giving back Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, but the Egyptians don't want Gaza, and Gaza ends up remaining under Israeli control. Later, a decade and a half later, you have Israel and Jordan who make peace. But again, you have the West Bank that prior to that was controlled by Jordan, which has not ended up going back into Jordanian hands because for a variety of reasons that, again, we'll jump into. But then what does that mean? You have the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza who before that were under Egyptian control, and the Palestinian Arabs who were prior to that under Jordanian control in the West Bank that now are under Israeli control. Now, those territories are disputed because they're up for negotiation. They were up for negotiation with Egypt and Jordan, but Jordan have withdrawn their claim and Egypt didn't want the Gaza Strip. So now those territories are under Israeli control, but not officially part of Israel. And that shifts into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So essentially what we get is an emerging Israeli-Palestinian conflict where you have the growing challenges of terrorism, counterterrorism, and military rule. That being said, it's become extremely complex where you have a lot of different situations on the ground that over the years have created more and more violence. And as a result of terror waves such as the Second Intifada, which follows the Oslo Accords and the breakdown of the peace process, you've had immense amounts of casualties on both sides. You've had Israelis and especially civilians who were targeted. 71% were targeted during the Second Intifada. And unfortunately, Israel suffered these losses and as a result had to put in certain security measures to fight that terrorism in the West Bank that has also in certain cases harmed Palestinian civilians. So since then, there's been peace processes that unfortunately have not gone anywhere, have been rejected by both sides. And what that's looked like is a constant state of violence. For today, we're going to be looking at the situation specifically within the Gaza Strip. And unfortunately, this graphic is going to have to be updated. But you've had a continuous repetition of violence, a cycle of violence in which Hamas instigates a war with Israel. Israel responds, and then after that, you have a continuous round of battles until there's a ceasefire. In which case there's a break for a little bit of time before Hamas breaks that ceasefire again, and you have the whole cycle repeat itself, which has led us to this day, where since October 7th, Hamas broke the ceasefire, and you've had continuing conflict with Hamas and other Islamic militant groups within the Gaza Strip. Now, we're going to start to move in now to understanding some of the terminology that's really going to dive into what's going on with the situation in the Gaza Strip. So to begin with, one thing that is often spoken about is the idea that the root of this conflict, even the root of this current round of violence and this current war with Hamas, is due to the occupation. So let's set a couple things straight. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip completely. All civilians and all military personnel were taken out. Even Jewish graves and Jewish cemeteries of the Gaza Strip were dug up, excavated, and reburied within Israel proper. And all of the territory was handed over to the Palestinian Authority. So up until this day, aside from the recent military operation, there's zero Israeli presence in the Gaza Strip. There is no occupation in the Gaza Strip. So first and foremost, that's just a complete lie to understand. In order to also dive into this term and understand why it's false and oftentimes weaponized without people understanding any context, we need to understand that even before Israel withdrew in 2005, this territory was governed according to the Oslo Accords, which were agreed upon both by the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. Therefore, the Gaza Strip was under mixed administration of both, with the intention on both sides at the time to create a two-state solution in which eventually large amounts of the Gaza Strip would become part of a Palestinian state. So that was already something that was on the table. And then prior to that, prior to the 1967 Six-Day War, the territory was under Egyptian control, not Palestinian control. When Israel took it over in the Six-Day War, Israel was in charge of controlling that territory from Egypt. After Egypt withdrew their claim, there wasn't right away a partner for Israel to even negotiate with removing this quote unquote occupation or dispute or administration, or whichever term you choose to use when referring to the Israeli presence there in the Gaza Strip. Therefore, it further complicates the situation. So when someone says that Hamas is committing these acts because of the occupation, it's easy to debunk it for a variety of reasons. One, Israel wasn't occupying the territory from Palestinians to begin with, because there wasn't a Palestinian state there in the Gaza Strip prior to the 1967 Six-Day War, in which Egypt was controlling it, nor was there after. Next, once there was a Palestinian Authority, Israel was negotiating with it in order to hand its territory over to the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority did have agreed upon control in areas of the Gaza Strip. And finally, in 2005, Israel completely withdrew from Gaza. So this idea of occupation being a cause for the current war with Hamas and Gaza is completely ludicrous. Unless people are referring to occupation meaning any Jewish presence between the river and the sea, meaning anywhere in the territory, in which case that's not occupation, that's Jews being in our indigenous homeland. Something else that has come up very recently that a lot of people don't have the context for, or know the context for, but are choosing to spread misinformation about, is a language around a siege or blockade on Gaza. So to begin with, the definition of a siege is when a military force surrounds a territory and doesn't allow anything in for the purpose of winning a military victory. That's not the case, nor has it ever been when it comes to Israel and Egypt, who both have a blockade over the Gaza Strip. The situation there is that, first and foremost, in 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. There was no blockade for 2 years, until in 2007, Hamas was democratically elected and then forcefully took power after a dispute with the Palestinian Authority over the Gaza Strip and started terror attacks. In an effort to prevent international aid and supplies into the Gaza Strip, from entering the Gaza Strip and falling into Hamas hands and being used for terrorist attacks, Israel placed a blockade in which they did allow supplies in, they did allow humanitarian aid in, and they continued to do so. That being said, there was always debate, including in Israeli society, on whether the blockade was too strict or not strict enough. And the blockade actually was revised in 2010. So the idea of it being a siege is completely false. The idea of it being an unnecessary blockade is completely false as well, because it's proven that you had aid going into Gaza that was stolen by Hamas and used for terror attacks, and Israel and Egypt both had a necessity to place a blockade on the Gaza Strip to ensure their security from the terrorist organization Hamas. So I think it's very important that people understand that. And finally, the idea that Israel immediately put Gaza under blockade right after withdrawing is often spread, and that's completely false. You had 2 years that the Palestinian Authority was in control of Gaza with no blockade. The only reason why there was a blockade is after Hamas took power. So next, we're going to talk about this idea of decolonization. This is something that's more of an abstract and academic idea that's been spread throughout all over the world, honestly, but especially in Western academic circles. I've seen it in Australia from things I've been following. I've seen it across South Africa. I've seen it across everywhere in North and South America, and of course in European canvases too. So to begin with, to understand how to debunk this claim that Hamas's actions against Israel are simply decolonization, we have to understand what is the meaning of colonialism and what is the meaning of colonization. In order, as we talked about earlier, for someone to be a colonialist, they have to come from a mother country to a foreign land and set up a colony in the name of that mother country in the foreign land that they have no connection to. We already established that Jewish presence in Israel does not fit the category of settler colonialism. Therefore, actions against Israel don't fit the category of decolonization. Next, let's actually take a minute to understand what is an example of decolonization. Jewish liberation or Zionism fits this category. You have an indigenous people who maintain their connection physically, culturally, and spiritually to their indigenous homeland, right? Jewish people for over 3,000 years. Over that time, they were occupied, they were expelled, they were fighting to return. And over that time, you had other groups of people who moved in there who also have a long-standing presence in the land. If you're looking at Palestinian Arabs, who are the descendants of the original Arab settlers who came in the 600s after the death of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. They have a long-standing claim to the land. You can't say that that's an indigenous claim, but it's a long-standing claim to the land. They're not going anywhere, shouldn't be forced to go anywhere. That being said, to say that Jews are coming into this territory that they have an indigenous connection to, establishing a state and defending itself from people who are descendants of settlers, if you're going to say that that's colonialism, you're false. If anything, that's a definition of decolonization, and it's one of the few successful definitions of it across the world. And finally, we need to understand what the goals and tactics are of Hamas. It's not about decolonization. The goals of Hamas are to establish an Islamist Sharia society across all the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That includes the genocide of the Jewish people. And it also includes establishing a state within a culture that is not indigenous to that land. Sharia law, Islamism, is not indigenous to the land of Israel. So for Hamas to attempt to portray their war against an indigenous people, the Jewish people, the Zionists, as decolonization is false in terms of goals, and also when it comes to tactics. We've seen the atrocities committed by Hamas against Israelis, against Israeli Jews, against Israeli Arabs, and against Israelis of every single community that lives within the diverse democracy of the state of Israel. Those tactics are genocidal, are pushing ethnic cleansing, and are not trying to accomplish anything besides the complete eradication of the Jewish people in Israel, and also encouraging violence and eradication of the Jewish people around the world. So besides the goals of what we already decided and explained that Hamas wants to establish, the tactics in which they're going about to accomplish those goals do not line up with the global definition of what it means for people to decolonize land that they're from. They only line up with genocide. Finally, or actually we're going to cover one more after this, ceasefire and peace. A lot of people right now are pushing this idea that, listen, maybe Hamas was bad. Maybe Hamas was wrong in their October 7th attack, but Israel responding militarily is not the right answer, is not going to lead to peace. Israel should just have a ceasefire, and then they'll be able to go ahead and basically negotiate for release of hostages. That's a lot of the rhetoric that's going on. But that doesn't address the root causes of this conflict. The root causes of the current war with Hamas is Hamas violence and instigation, and terrorism, and anti-Semitism. A ceasefire does nothing to address the issue of Hamas, which violently took power over the Gaza Strip, their terrorist antics and their terrorist activities, nor the anti-Semitism they're continuing to perpetrate. It puts everything on pause, and it doesn't actually address the root causes. Next, we have to understand that when it comes to the idea of releasing hostages, and a ceasefire is going to accomplish that, there was a ceasefire on October 6th. And there's been occasion after occasion after occasion in these rounds of violence with Hamas, in which Hamas violated ceasefires, including on October 7th, when they went to take hostages to begin with. So the idea that a ceasefire is going to get the hostages back is completely false, because there was a ceasefire in place on October 6th, and that didn't stop Hamas from going out of their way to break it to take hostages to begin with. The only way to get rid of this current threat and address the root causes is to remove Hamas from power. That's the only way that you're going to put an end to their terror rule, which inflicts damage across Israeli society, as well as Palestinian society, which we can see all throughout social media, as well as testimonies of innocent Palestinian civilians who are being harmed by Hamas's actions right now. Creating a ceasefire will do nothing to solve this conflict, as well as the fact that it's been tried time and time again, and it's got us exactly to where we are today. This is the second to last. We have to understand the issue of civilian casualties. First and foremost, we need to understand that any time a civilian suffers as a result of this conflict, as a result of terrorism, it's a casualty. It's a casualty and it's a tragedy. Whether it's a Palestinian civilian who's innocent and unrelated who's suffering, or an Israeli civilian who's unrelated and suffering, it's a tragedy. And it's 100% okay, valid, and I think human for us to be able to recognize that. And we need to address who is responsible for civilian casualties. For the past over 2 weeks, Israel has encouraged the Palestinian civilian population to evacuate northern Gaza and move to safe zones in southern Gaza because of the pending and now began ground invasion as well as airstrikes. Hamas, on multiple occasions, has prevented its civilians from leaving and fleeing to these safe zones. They have stated live and issued public statements that they are not allowing any Gazan civilians to move. They've set up roadblocks. There are testimonies of them stealing people's car keys to prevent them from fleeing to safe zones in the south. So when we're talking about who's responsible for civilian casualties, it's not something that's taken lightly. Israel, more than any other nation in the world, does everything that they can, including things such as warning in advance of invasion, that put their own troops even at risk. They do immense amounts of work in order to prevent civilian casualties on the other side. That being said, it's a tragedy that it's not always successful because of the nature of this war and because of the nature of Hamas actions that prevent its own civilians from leaving, as well as actually firing rockets from civilian areas or storing weapons in civilian areas, such as schools, UN facilities, mosques, and hospitals. Right now, it's believed to be that Hamas headquarters is underneath the Shiva hospital in Gaza City. What does that mean? That means that it forces Israel to be in this dilemma constantly of A, warning civilians in advance, in which case you're also warning Hamas in advance of impending invasions, which we've seen in the past has resulted in heightened Israeli casualties, but Israel still does it. Or B, to tolerate constant rocket fire. And if I check my phone right now, there were more rockets just shot within the past few minutes. It's coming out of civilian areas in Gaza and targeting civilian areas in Israel. So Israeli forces are stuck with this dilemma of, are we going to tolerate and allow our own civilians to die? Or are we going to take the risk of warning Palestinian civilians and striking these targets? And it's not something to be taken lightly, and it needs to be understood that Israel does everything in its power to prevent those civilian casualties and also recognizes that they're tragic. And that leads us to our final point about proportional force versus excessive force. Another piece of rhetoric that's heard commonly is that, Israel's using disproportionate force against Gaza. Now, or disproportionate also refers to excessive force. We have to first understand, what are the goals of this military operation? The goals of this military operation is not to create just another round of violence that results in nothing and a repeat of this whole cycle again in another year or 2 or 7. The goal is to dislodge and remove the terrorist organization Hamas from power because they're the root cause of these constant, repeated rounds of violence. So Hamas firing one rocket and Israel firing one rocket randomly back into Gaza is not going to solve that issue. Targeted, calculated strikes that remove Hamas from power is going to solve the root cause of this current war. Next, one thing that I often personally ask when people talk about what about Israel's proportional force or disproportionate force, what would proportional force look like in response to the October 7th and subsequent attacks? Hamas terrorists, upwards of 2,000, invaded the state of Israel, attacked Israeli civilians, kidnapped Israeli civilians, murdered, and committed things that I don't even want to speak about right now. A proportionate response to that, would that be Israel going into Gaza and doing the exact same thing to Gazan civilians? Would that be proportional? Maybe. Would that be just and moral? No. And would that fulfill the goals of this military operation? No. So the idea of proportional force when you're fighting asymmetric warfare in which one side is engaging in terrorism doesn't exist. Israel is doing what it has to do to use the right amount of proportional force in proportion to the goals of the military operation, which is to dislodge Hamas from power. And when someone comes at you with that question, the best thing to do is flip it around and ask, what would proportional force look like? And no answer they're going to be able to give you is going to actually achieve the goals that need to be put in place in order to achieve a lasting peace in the region. So with that, I want to put this up here. There's a quick list of terminology, different terms that are used, and alternative phrasing that you could use in order to address different situations and topics. I'm going to leave this up while we do the Q&A. Before we do that, I want to just touch on the fact that there's always ways to be involved and to get feedback. If you want information at standwithus.com and across our social media, we're constantly posting updates, and we have a situation room that keeps you in the loop, not only about what's going on in Israel, but also what's going on in your communities and communities around the world, and ways for you to stay united with our partners as well. So with that, I'd love to open it up for a question and answer, and I'm going to go back to that slide that shows the different terminology, because these are all relevant topics that you might have heard about, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of them.
Thank you, Noah. And now we'd like to welcome up the Q&A. Before we start, 2 quick rules. Be clear in your questions. And the second rule, ask questions, not statements. We have 2 roving mics, and we have time for questions. Please take the opportunity to ask Noah.
Hi. Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. My question is, do you also have strategies within our own community that we can use? Like, I understand that people are naming and shaming those that are taking down posters in the United States. Is that something we should be doing? The people that show up and do and say from the river to the sea, should we be identifying who they are and going after them either for hate speech or even letting their employers know or future employers know who they are and what they stand for?
So that's a really great question. I think that first and foremost, it needs to be taken into context of what's the best route and plan of action for your specific community. I can tell you in the United States, one thing that's worked is obviously going after these people who are taking it down using every legal method. So at Stand With Us, we have a legal department that we assist students in the United States who are facing these sorts of issues on a regular basis. So when you have elements of hate speech or incitement of violence, especially on college campuses, we'll say, or in public institutions or public spaces, there is usually a route that you can go, the legal method, to at least let the authorities know. So that's number one. And I'd say number two that we've seen that's incredibly effective, not necessarily just going after that 5% of people who are already anti-Zionist, but appealing to that 90%, is raising awareness to begin with and continuing to be persistent about raising awareness about the people who are being kidnapped. So every time they're taking down posters, we're putting up more posters. Every time they're coming to protest against us, we have another rally where we're raising awareness about bringing our people home. So I think obviously going after institutional methods of dealing with these people, when you have authorities who can get involved, especially when you have people who are breaking the law when it comes to hate speech or incitement of violence, is definitely a route to go. And it depends on your locality, what the best source to reach out to is.
Hello. Do you think Hamas will release the hostages?
So that's another really amazing question. I pray that Hamas will release the hostages. As a lot of people have pointed out, that doesn't seem to be an option without the current military invasion and the current military methods. And I think it's really important that we follow very closely what the IDF is saying and what strategies they're using, because a lot of that kind of, again, hits the point that people are saying, well, you just have a ceasefire, Hamas is going to release the hostages. Well, there was a ceasefire when Hamas took the hostages. So at the end of the day, Hamas is the obstacle to the hostages being released. And in order to ensure that they're going to actually be released safely, Israel needs to do something, and is doing something, to put pressure, military pressure on Hamas to make sure that this can never happen again.
I'm in that cohort of people that wake up every morning and scroll through my Instagram to get my updates. It's so refreshing to be out of that cycle and to listen for more than 30 minutes. I work in an organisation. There are very few Jews, so I'm taking that part and trying to explain as much as possible about the situation to the wider community, to non-Jewish people. I'm often asked, is there a resource that I can look at to understand more? What would be your number one book or podcast or resource that I can share with them?
So that's a really great question. I think that one thing that I automatically do, I actually had a situation where I was talking to quite a few of my non-Jewish friends who I went to high school with, who are completely unfamiliar with this. And I would actually refer them to Stand With Us. We have Israel 101. You can listen to it as a podcast on YouTube. We have it posted, the entire presentation, as well as booklets for people to be able to read along to and follow more specific details and sort of take their time with it. So that's something that we do a lot as far as putting educational resources about the Jewish story, but also ones that are more specific about the different conflicts that are going on within the land and the roots of those.
Hi, David Slade. Thank you very much for your presentation. What do you say to those people who say that Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria is the cause or part of the cause of the conflict, and the fact that we're there and we shouldn't be there is a real problem? How do you handle that part, notwithstanding the issues in Gaza?
So really great question. I'm glad you brought it up so we can take a minute to look at the bigger picture as well, because it's something that we can't and should not ignore. Being, that we're Zionists, and within the Zionist camp, you have people all the way to the left and all the way to the right. There are some people who want to highlight the fact that in their belief, our presence within Judea and Samaria, within the West Bank, is part of the reason why we have this conflict going on. That's something that's up for debate, that you can debate both ways, saying that it's a reason for this conflict to continue to go on. I'm not going to give my personal opinion, but in general, if I'm talking to someone who says that that's a reason, I say, well, there's different ways to go back and forth about that. When someone says that that's the sole reason for this conflict, which I think happens more often than not, there's a couple ways that you can debate them. First of all, the notion that you mentioned towards the end of your question that people oftentimes bring up is that Jews shouldn't be there. Jews have an indigenous connection to the land there. If you want to talk about politically what's the best thing to happen, there's different opinions, from a one-state solution to a two-state solution to confederation model. To assert that Jews as a people don't have a right to live in that territory is the same as asserting, or actually isn't the same, because Arabs don't have an indigenous connection to the land, but is harmful the same way as it is to assert that Arabs should have no right to live in the state of Israel. It's unfair, and it's important to call people out, because while you can have different political opinions on what should be which state, to assert that Jewish people don't have a right to live in land that's historically part of the Jewish civilization is extremely problematic, and I would say is cultural erasure. Moving on from there, the political nature of it, saying that Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank is the sole cause of this conflict, it's very easy to debunk that. Between 1949 and 1967, there was no Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria, but the conflict had already been going on. In the process of the Oslo Accords, you had the plans for Jews in the future and Israelis to move out of Judea and Samaria, but the conflict was still going on, and you had higher numbers of terrorist attacks during the Oslo Accords period than you had before. So we had hopeful steps about moving forward to the future, and you also had disappointments. After the Oslo Accords, they collapsed as a result of Palestinian leadership refusing a peace agreement that would have taken Jews and Israeli presence completely out of Judea and Samaria, with the exception of a couple specific places that would have been compensated into the new Palestinian state with land swaps. So the assertion that that's the root cause of this conflict is false, and it's been proven false on so many different levels, whether that's pre-67, whether that's during the Oslo period, or whether that's with the rejection of Oslo and the current state of things.
It's not necessarily to what you've just been speaking about, but as a Melburnian, and I just feel that I'm very powerless, and I really would like, and he's given us some tools if we're speaking, but I feel like I need to know exactly all the organisations and exactly all the businesses and exactly all the people who've been speaking about us, so that I know not to ever go there again. And I just like a register, I'd like a register so that I can tick off and say, I'm not going to buy my croissants there, and I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to do something else, which is, I feel, as much as I can do.
I could just say I relate to you. A personal note, the amount of musicians I've taken off my playlist as a musician myself, it's astronomical. But also it gives me the chance to focus on the Jewish artists and the Jewish businesses that now I get to support because of how much support they've been giving to us, and also the non-Jewish businesses, many of who've come out in support of Israel as strong allies.
Well, and this is a personal point of view, not a UIA point of view. I always worry about lists, to be really honest, and to be very careful that we don't stoop to a lower level than others. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to use this as an example, okay? And I hope no one minds me taking a moment to do this. We had a situation with an organisation in Collingwood who displayed anti-Semitic messages and signs on their window. When confronted, they were not apologetic, okay? I put that into a category on its own. There was the managing director of Loon who made terribly horrible comments, but when he was pulled up, he apologised profusely, I think genuinely, and committed to education. And I would hate to think that someone who's made a mistake would get cancelled or banned forever. So my point is, I understand your point of view and I respect it and I have empathy for it. I think as Jews, we need to be very careful of lists because the opposite occurs to us.
So, yeah, perhaps that is a bad choice.
But it should be groups of people or organisations that if you have an opportunity,
I'll make you a big list.
if you had an opportunity to engage with them and they may then have understood better your position and apologised, then you can decide for yourself. But I don't really want to support anyone who has, when I can support someone else. Yeah. So, and I haven't. Yes, and I won't ever go back to learn because because it's my not.
Hi, Noah. Hi, Noah. I've just got a question. I've just got a question building on one that we had earlier. Do you say to non-Jewish people who are looking for unbiased resource? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm able to hear.
Or resources that, or ways to differentiate between the fact from the fiction and kind of sift through the information that they're receiving?
All right, great question. So from the Stand With Us perspective, we're a non-biased organization. We're not right-wing or left-wing. Of course, we're a Zionist organization because we believe in the Jewish right of self-determination. That being said, I'll tell you me personally, what I do to continue to understand all the different perspectives, even if I'm speaking in a non-biased way, it's important to understand all the different voices that are players on the ground. I go and I read the news sources from every single different perspective that there is, including plenty who I disagree with. It's not always easy. Don't always have the patience for it, especially if it's a situation where there's basic lies. But I always encourage people, find a source. I'm here. I'm going to be able to tell you objective facts, but also seek out perspectives, including those that you don't necessarily agree with, to at least understand what other people are saying. And that'll help you find the truth in the mix of everything. As far as understanding, misinformation that's all over the place, we actually do a whole presentation specifically on that. One way, something that you've seen a lot recently, is there's been a lot of fake images circulated that if you do a Google image reverse search, you'll quickly see that it's something that oftentimes didn't happen during this recent conflicts, and oftentimes didn't even happen within the Gaza Strip. So you get a lot of misinformation that way. In addition to that, you always want to look in every article you read for supporting sources. If you see something pop up and you can't find it anywhere else, or it's not linked to any actual primary source that you can track, it's usually false. So I think that that's something that's extremely important to tell. And also sometimes I'll tell you personally, it helps to dig a little bit deeper. So a lot of times I'll get hate comments on my social media, and I'll just want to ignore them because I'll be like, it's just a bunch of nonsense. But a couple of days ago, I got a hate comment alleging something about, how Israel deserves this and is a racist country because of their treatment of Black Jews. I'm a Black Jew myself. I decided, you know what, I'm going to respond to this person with facts. I responded to them with facts about the situation on the ground. I'm not going to get too into the details. Because I thought, you know what, at least let me correct misinformation and be proactive about it for the next person who's scrolling through comments. And I don't want them to get a misconception. And not only did I give my perspective and give a little bit of objectivity, but I actually exposed the original commenter who was spreading misinformation for, I don't know a nicer way to say it, but the crazy person he was. Because after I responded to this comment, his response to me following that was that Hamas doesn't exist at all and is an Israeli conspiracy to continue the Nakba. So from that perspective, anyone who's in the 90% wants to find a real non-biased source is going to read my comment full of facts and references, and then this crazy conspiracy theorist, and be able to tell where the truth is more likely leaning. So there's a variety of different ways, from looking for supporting sources, cross-referencing, and also looking at authors to see if they only ever report about a certain topic, to see if they might focus or even a bias. And then there's also proactive things we can do to get out there in the comments and actually spread the truth.
Hi, I want to say thank you for the presentation. You sort of answered a little bit of what I was going to ask, but I'm fascinated about what's going on college campuses in America. And I'm sort of wondering, you talk about the 5% who sort of are Zionists, the 5% who are anti-Zionists, and the 90% in between. But who should we spend our time, like, I don't even want to use the word arguing, but sort of giving our peace of mind and explaining what's going on? Because there's an element of kids, you kind of think, okay, on university campuses, well, they're kind of stupid, they'll grow up. Then you kind of think it's coming from the professors, and you kind of think you can't really change their views. So, and the lay people who are just protesting in the street seem to be ignorant. So I'm just trying to figure out where you best spend your time combating anti-Semitism, because it feels very in your face at the moment from all directions. And I just don't know where I should spend my energy besides scrolling and watching everything about Israel at the moment. But I'm really fascinated with what you can say to people face to face, because one-on-one is obviously better, but online, and I don't know what I'm spending my time doing with when I can't change someone's opinion.
So when I look at things online, I look at the same way as if I'm on a college campus in the middle of a quad, where I'm in a classroom, a lecture hall with 100 students and one professor, a couple students who are promoting this misinformation. It seems like I'm only talking to the 5% of people who are anti-Zionist. But in reality, I already have accepted that, maybe eventually they'll change their mind. That's not up to me. But I'm, because of my own personal experiences, not very focused on changing a bigot's mind. I don't think that it's something to spend a lot of time doing. That being said, I have to always keep it in the back of my head that my voice might be the only time that the silent majority, the silent 90% who's apathetic, misinformed, or uninformed, hears a Jewish or Zionist perspective. So if I'm just one-on-one with someone who is a conspiracy theorist, anti-Semite, bigot, Hamas supporter, maybe I want to correct them because I think it's important to show people that they can't just spout that sort of hatred without a response, but it's not necessarily going to be the most productive conversation. If I'm in social media or if I'm in a quad, it's important to always refute facts and make sure you're acknowledging and answering whatever question they bring up, whether that's you saying that you think they're misinformed, you're offended, or you understand where they're coming from, to reframe their question and give it more context, and finally to get your message across. Because even if that person in the 5% doesn't hear it, the 90% are going to at least hear the fact that there's another perspective out there. And quick personal story that I'll tell about this, about an experience I had with someone, was I went on a trip when I was a sophomore in university, second year, and we came to Israel and went all over the Palestinian territories as well. It was me and 4 other Jewish student leaders and 20 non-Jewish student leaders. And one day we were coming back from hearing a speaker in the Palestinian territories who I completely disagreed with. He was saying things about how Israel doesn't really need to defend itself. Israel is the only reason why there's a conflict is because of their aggression, yada, yada, yada. All these things I'd heard, and I was used to tuning out. And we're on the bus back, and one of my non-Jewish peers is like, okay, so Noah, like, would you define yourself as a Zionist? Spoiler alert, I made Aliyah, I moved to Israel, I work for Stand With Us. Of course I'm a Zionist. I take it for granted. So I told her, of course I'm a Zionist. And she looked at me confused, and she's like, well, the speaker we just heard talked about the evils of Zionism and how Zionism is racism and Zionism is genocide. And I know you, Noah, and you don't support genocide, you don't support racism, and you don't support apartheid. So, and you don't support the certain policies of the current Israeli government. So how can you be a Zionist? It's quick for me to correct her and say, you know, actually, Zionism is just the belief in a Jewish state in our homeland. But then I was able to flip the question, and I asked her, what do you think about the conflict and the outcome should be? And she gave me a laundry list of things that she disagreed with, about settlement policy, about the current situation with the Green Line and the checkpoints and the security barrier and what she thinks the border should look like, about the status of Jerusalem, about how she doesn't agree with the prime minister at the time's policies on A, B, and C. And at the end of the day, I said, okay, I can agree with you about some of those. I can disagree with you about some of those. I can think you're misinformed. But you believe that there should be some sort of Jewish state in the territory. And she's like, yeah, of course. And I looked at this girl who was a classmate and had voted to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel because she thought she was an anti-Zionist. I looked her in the eye and I said, you know, you're talking about how you have all these disagreements with Israel that I know Israelis who have the same disagreements with the government about. But you still believe that there should be a Jewish state here. So we might disagree and we might agree on different topics. But at the end of the day, you're a Zionist. And for her, it was mind-blowing to even hear that truth. And I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of people in the 90% who don't even know what Zionism is. So every time you're talking to someone, even if it doesn't seem like you're going to change their mind, especially online, it's even more than 90% of people who don't know anything, who are just scrolling past, and you might be the only Jewish or Zionist voice they hear.
We've got time for one more question.
Are there any differences when communicating with people who have a natural affinity or association? They might have family or friends that are closely associated with Palestinian people, and you know what is the impact of that advocacy when, I mean, so I'm looking at our democracy and seeing that there's an increasing voting bloc that has sort of natural affinity with basically objections to Israel's existence based on some of the messaging in the Arab world. So how do we manage that and communicate and advocate for the things that you're saying? And I realize there's probably some overlap with the things you've already said.
Right, so I think that's a great question and it's a great point. I personally have to look a little bit at more specific statistics to prove that, but anytime you have anyone who's more connected to this conflict, you're going to have more of a perspective on the issue and more skin in the game. So I think that it could go both ways. You know, I've met a lot of people who have more skin in the game, so they're more humane about the other side. They understand the other side more because they also have something to lose and they can empathize. And I've met other people who have skin in the game. They lost somebody, and that's led them to have more harsh or strict or closed-minded view of what should happen in the end. And I think that that's kind of just a natural trend that you see psychologically. Now, when it comes to people who have a natural affinity and how can you reach out and advocate to them, I think a lot of it has to do with being proactive about telling the Jewish story. And a lot of it also could end up just being damage control. Because if someone has a natural affinity, you can work on working at that misinformation that they might have grown up hearing, that they might have been biased, or the racism or incitement that's been present in their society against the Jewish community. You can work on that, but that's a different goal than the damage control of preventing the messaging that they received from spreading to a population that doesn't necessarily have that tunnel vision or that closed mind to the actual truth. So I think a lot of the danger we see is, of course, you want to talk about the people who've been brainwashed and have been incited by different media sources within their communities, but you also want to look at preventing that from affecting groups of people who haven't necessarily.
Thank you very much, Noah, for your efforts and time in educating us and assisting us to combat anti-Semitism in our discourse. And I would now like to introduce Ashley Pike to close.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Shana. Thank you, Noah, for your incredible insight, your advocacy techniques, and I guess sharing with us your level of maturity and the koach that we all need right now. Whilst we continue to grieve deeply for those that lost their lives on 7th of October and the hostages that we pray come home and alive, the most effective action that we can take now while dealing with this sorrow is to arm ourselves with the knowledge and information that you have shared. We appreciate the incredible work that you are doing for Stand With Us. I don't think there is anyone in the room that actually ever thought never again would be here today. But the harsh and sobering reality is that it is. And truthfully now, we all need to join together, just like we have tonight, to keep learning and building up our strength. Noah and Stand With Us, kol hakavod. We wish you in all your advocacy work. Just keep going, keep up the strength and be safe. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming here today. Some of us, in fact, all of us have felt lost as how to respond to our wider circles. That's why we're here and that's why we've chosen the speakers today. We feel lost on social media. We feel lost in our workplace. We feel lost around our friends. We truly feel lost in our home, Australia. And now is the time that we need to educate ourselves in a measured and considered manner. It's important that we show the world our wounds. They hold more weight than a fist can throw. But let's use these as a tool to